Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about an HOA that definitely should not have fined us. I was halfway out the door when I saw the pale envelope sticking out of my mailbox. In bold letters across the front, there was the name of our newly formed homeowners association, one that had been installed just a few months earlier after a controversial vote. My instinct told me this was something important, so I tore it open right then and there, not even waiting to get inside. Inside was a formal letter threatening substantial fines for unauthorized pool construction. It went on to claim that my entire property was in violation of new neighborhood regulations. My jaw dropped. I was fully aware of our neighborhood's original guidelines, and my in-ground pool had been installed long before the new board had arrived on the scene. Besides, our old rules had clearly permitted that type of pool, provided it met certain safety standards. In fact, my setup had not only passed every safety inspection, but had been endorsed by the previous HOA for its neat landscaping and secure fencing. Now, here I was, facing fines from a newly appointed board that claimed I was in the wrong. I couldn't help laughing a little. Was this some outlandish clerical error? Whatever it was, I had a sneaking suspicion this was just the beginning. I walked back inside, scanning the letter line by line. My immediate reaction was that there had to be some mix-up. Why in the world would a new board, a group claiming to uphold the values of our close-knit community, retroactively penalize me for a pool that was already approved and standard in this part of the county? The more I read, the more furious I became. The fine itself was astronomical. Worse still, the language in the letter implied I could face recurring charges every month I remained in violation. They threatened that if I didn't act fast, basically fill in my pool or rebuild it to meet some random new standards, I could be on the hook for thousands of dollars in penalties. I was furious, of course, but also confused. Nobody had said anything about new regulations regarding pools at the last community meeting. The entire thing felt underhanded. I remember calling my friend Quincy, one of my closest neighbors who also happened to have a pool, and asking him if he'd received anything from the HOA. He let out a bitter laugh on the phone, admitting he'd just gotten a nearly identical letter. His described the same nonsense, that he'd constructed an unapproved structure and would be subject to massive fines. His pool, like mine, had been installed years ago, well before the new board had even been proposed. We realized pretty quickly this was no paperwork slip-up. They were targeting us. Word traveled fast around our neighborhood. We live on a street full of families who are friendly enough to look out for each other, but who generally stick to their own business. Our cul-de-sac is known for its sense of privacy, with large backyards and roomy houses that people had bought specifically for the perks, like the possibility of adding a pool. But once these letters started showing up, everyone began sharing stories. A total of 13 houses with in-ground pools had been singled out. Every letter claimed the same violation: unauthorized construction that didn't comply with the brand new guidelines the board insisted were critical for preserving property values. Curious about these so-called guidelines, I logged onto the HOA's official portal to see if anything had changed. The old homeowner association's rules were nowhere to be found. Everything had been replaced by complicated new regulations that basically outlawed any backyard addition that wasn't first approved by the new board. Moreover, the language seemed vague enough to allow them to pass judgment on anything, even structures that were built under older, valid regulations. It was enraging, and I couldn't help thinking, is this even legal? While I was stewing over these changes, Quincy took it upon himself to confront the new HOA president, a man named Cyrus. Cyrus was a flashy character, recently moved in from across the country, and he'd somehow rallied enough people to overthrow our old board in a fractious neighborhood vote. I'd never trusted him. He loved going around the neighborhood, boasting about how he had connections at local government offices and how he aimed to maintain the highest standards. He had a presence that made you feel like he was always looking down on you. In my brief interactions, he'd never once asked how I was doing or how my family was settling in. It was always about him. So when Quincy tried to reason with him to point out we'd had these pools for years with zero complaints, Cyrus reportedly just smirked and said something along the lines of, "We're cleaning up the neighborhood, and if you can't follow the new standards, you're out of luck." He ended the conversation by quoting an exorbitant daily fine that would be tacked on until our so-called violation was remedied. That's when I realized we were dealing with a power play. The entire setup felt deliberate, like they'd invented rules guaranteed to penalize existing homeowners, so the new board could rake in fines or force modifications that aligned with their personal taste. I was furious. Quincy was too. My next step was to speak with a friend of mine named Maybelle, who was a lawyer specializing in property disputes. We'd known each other since college, and I figured she could clarify the legalities involved. She was genuinely shocked when I showed her the letter and the revised regulations. Her immediate comment was that it was suspicious for an HOA to try and apply new rules retroactively without any formal grandfather clause. Usually, there has to be a hearing or some official grace period before they can enforce new standards. She suspected the board might be crossing legal lines. At the very least, it was an unfair practice, if not outright illegal. A few days later, after I'd spoken with Maybelle, I decided we needed a collective approach. It was clear this new board was systematically targeting a specific group of residents, those with pools that had all been previously approved. In total, 13 houses were affected. We organized an informal meeting at my place one Saturday afternoon, asking everyone who'd received that dreaded letter to show up and discuss our next steps. There were couples, single homeowners, and even retirees who had installed their pools primarily for grandchildren. Some had relatively simple designs, others had more elaborate backyard layouts, but everyone shared the same letter with nearly identical wording. The fine amounts varied, but each was huge and threatened to rise each month. The sense of outrage in that room was immediate and intense. During that gathering, we shared copies of the letters and discovered they'd all been mailed out on the exact same day. It had clearly been orchestrated. We also pulled up the new HOA regulations from their official site and pored over them. The language was so convoluted, it took us a couple of hours to decipher all the sections that impacted pool ownership. The new board basically invented requirements that were close to impossible to meet. They insisted on updated fencing designs, specialized drainage systems, and specific landscaping that had to be approved by the board. Our existing fences, drains, and decks, fully compliant under the old HOA, had suddenly been deemed invalid. Some members of the group pointed out that local building codes for pools in our county hadn't changed at all, meaning the only real changes were these new board-imposed demands. If we were to comply, we'd have to spend tens of thousands of dollars each to rebuild or modify perfectly safe and legal pools. We all found that outrageous. The more we discussed it, the more it became apparent that this might be a calculated money grab. One neighbor, Leon, an accountant by trade, analyzed the potential revenue from these fines. If everyone just coughed up the money without a fight, the HOA would accumulate a hefty sum. The potential monthly income from the threatened fines was absolutely staggering. The question was, what did the new board plan to do with all that money? Leon pointed out that none of the new guidelines mentioned improvements to common areas or other neighborhood upgrades, things you'd typically expect from an HOA. Instead, they seemed singularly focused on punishing pool owners. It reeked of corruption. Buoyed by a sense of communal resolve, we decided to take action. We formed a smaller committee within our group to spearhead a collective legal push, and we agreed to chip in for the legal fees. Maybelle offered to guide us, but she was a solo practitioner focusing on family law and minor real estate disputes. This potential lawsuit was a big step beyond her usual docket. She recommended we retain a specialized law firm known for taking on HOAs. Although we worried about expenses, we recognized that dealing with a strong legal team was our best chance of either stopping these fines or winning any litigation that might arise. We called around, eventually connecting with a mid-sized firm that had a stellar record in property rights cases. They seemed confident we had a viable claim, especially because the new board was applying rules after the fact without any formal approval process or grandfathering clause. That confidence was exactly the moral boost we needed. Emboldened, we sent out a joint letter to the HOA, explaining that we believed these fines were unlawful. We gave them a deadline to cease and desist all collection efforts. If they continued, we'd have no choice but to escalate the matter with a lawsuit. I still remember the day we mailed that letter. There was a collective sense of relief among us, like we were finally putting our foot down. But as you might guess, the HOA responded with defiance. They sent back a curt notice insisting they were well within their rights to set new standards in the community. In their view, any previously approved pool was irrelevant because the new association's regulations supersede all prior versions. They warned us that if we persisted, they could escalate beyond mere fines, including property liens and other legally enforceable actions. The arrogance was off the charts. At that point, we realized any further negotiation with them was pointless. They weren't going to negotiate or see reason. So we moved forward with our lawsuit, filing it in county court. Our claim was straightforward. The HOA's attempt to apply newly minted guidelines to pre-existing pools violated the principle that changes can't be forced retroactively without a clear, legally approved procedure. We sought not only to stop the fines, but also damages for the stress and financial burdens they had already inflicted upon us. Our attorney was confident that the new board's approach was not only unethical, but also in direct conflict with established HOA governance laws in our state. The wait for the court date stretched on for months. During that time, the HOA still tried to collect fines. Some neighbors received repeated threatening letters, and at least one individual, my neighbor Simone, had a lien notice slapped on her property. That single move sent chills through the entire group because once a lien is in place, it can complicate a homeowner's ability to refinance or sell. Of course, Simone forwarded all of this to our legal team, who quickly filed additional motions asking for injunctive relief. In the meantime, though, the psychological stress was real. People worried about their finances, their credit scores, and the overall well-being of their families. It was an incredibly tense few months. Our once peaceful neighborhood became ground zero for a standoff that could ruin lives. To make matters worse, Cyrus, the new board president, started making the rounds more frequently. He'd drive by slowly, glaring at anyone whose yard he considered unkempt or non-compliant. We even had a neighbor, Celia, who claimed she caught him walking onto her property while she was out, presumably to inspect her pool area. She threatened to call the police if he ever did that again. Another homeowner, Marcus, actually installed security cameras to monitor any unwanted intrusions. The atmosphere was nothing short of toxic. A place that used to feel welcoming and safe became fraught with paranoia and tension. Amid all this, a twist emerged. It turned out that the new HOA board, led by Cyrus, had commissioned a landscaping company to overhaul some of the community's shared spaces at a staggering cost. No one had heard about it at any public meeting, and none of us had voted on any major expenditures. Typically, HOAs require at least some form of community consultation or voting when large budget decisions are made. This was a suspicious contract, especially because the rumored cost was unbelievably high. A couple of neighbors started investigating the finances, reaching out to the landscaping firm for quotes to compare with the official documents. Surprisingly, those neighbors discovered that the publicly stated price for the project was nearly triple the quote the landscaping firm had provided them privately for the same scope of work. Something smelled rotten. It suggested that the board was funneling money somewhere, maybe into their own pockets. Although we didn't know for sure, it hinted at deeper corruption. We passed this new information along to our attorneys. They included it in our growing legal file, suspecting that if the board was engaged in financial misconduct, that could further strengthen our case. Eventually, the first court hearing arrived. It was mostly procedural, but we managed to secure a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from collecting or enforcing any further fines related to the pool controversy until the case was resolved. That was a major relief. It meant no new liens could be placed and that everyone could breathe a bit while the legal wheels kept turning. In the discovery phase, we requested access to all the HOA's internal documentation concerning the new regulations, meeting minutes, bylaws, budgeting proposals, everything. The board fought us tooth and nail, stalling and refusing to produce certain documents. We had to file multiple motions to compel them to comply. In the process, some revealing emails came to light. From what we gathered, it looked like Cyrus had orchestrated a plan to single out the existing pools, brand them as violations under newly created standards, and then slap fines on the homeowners for non-compliance. The tone of these emails was shockingly cavalier. One message from Cyrus to another board member read, "If they can't or won't comply, we'll bury them in fines. They either pay or they leave, and we can flip their houses for a profit." It was nauseating to see those words in black and white. This was never about preserving property values or maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic. It was a blatant money grab, an attempt to muscle people out so they could profit from reselling our homes or collecting steep fees. At the very least, it was unethical. At worst, it was a calculated plan to defraud residents. Outrage boiled over. Even some neighbors who initially supported Cyrus's vision of a premium neighborhood started to distance themselves when they saw just how underhanded his tactics were. Some recognized that it could be them next, targeted for another arbitrary violation. Our side of the lawsuit gained momentum, and as we pieced together a robust case, it became clear the HOA was on shaky legal ground. They tried to claim we were being frivolous, but the evidence spoke for itself, especially those emails. Our attorneys built a compelling narrative. We had documented proof of the old rules that allowed our pools, the abrupt shift to new rules without proper voting or procedures, the predatory nature of the fines, and the discovered plan for personal financial gain. When the trial finally began, the tension was palpable. We'd all prepared for months, but actually sitting in that courtroom brought back the anger, the stress, and the sense of injustice. On one side sat 13 families, many of us with children or extended families that had grown to love our backyards over the years. On the other side sat Cyrus and a handful of board members, looking smug and self-assured. The opening statements from our attorney laid out the timeline meticulously, showing exactly how each step led to the board's manufactured violations. The defense tried to argue that the HOA had every right to protect property values through updated guidelines, but they couldn't explain away those incriminating emails, nor could they justify the contract discrepancies or the board's refusal to disclose certain financial records to members. Witnesses were called. Several neighbors, myself included, testified about the emotional and financial stress. We had copies of the threatening letters, proof of permits from the old HOA, and statements from local contractors who verified that our pools met the required building codes. Even the local zoning official testified on our behalf, confirming that no county regulations had changed to justify the board's sudden shift. The defense tried their best to paint us as homeowners unwilling to maintain proper standards, but our documentation overshadowed their claims. Meanwhile, an accountant testified about irregularities in the HOA's finances. He pointed out that huge sums of money were allocated to projects that seemed either inflated or incomplete. The suspicious landscaping contract took center stage, raising the question of where those extra funds were actually going. Cyrus took the stand eventually, and he tried to come across as a dedicated community leader, claiming he only wanted to improve the neighborhood. But when confronted with his own email that said, "We'll bury them in fines," his face went pale. He stumbled through a flimsy explanation about frustration in the heat of the moment, but the damage was done. Even the judge seemed irritated by the obvious contradiction in his testimony. The trial lasted longer than I expected, spanning nearly 2 weeks. By the time closing arguments were made, we felt confident we'd done everything we could to prove the HOA board's conduct was not just unfair, but possibly orchestrated for personal gain. We then waited nervously for the verdict. It came in the form of a written ruling from the judge, delivered in a plain envelope much like those dreaded fine notices. But this one brought a very different outcome. The judge's verdict was a sweeping condemnation of the HOA's actions. He stated that the board had acted in bad faith, applying new regulations without a proper vote, ignoring grandfather clauses, and imposing burdensome fines without legitimate cause. He nullified all fines, declared the liens invalid, and issued a permanent injunction against the enforcement of any similarly retroactive rules. More than that, the judge noted that the board had exhibited a level of willful misconduct in its financial dealings, awarding us damages to the tune of $874,000, split among the 13 households. The sum was intended not just to reimburse legal fees, but also to compensate for the stress, time, and hardship the board's malicious campaign inflicted upon us. When we heard the ruling, we collectively let out a stunned hush, followed by cheers that probably echoed through the hallway. We'd done it. We'd stood up for our rights, fought back against an unjust system, and we'd won. In that moment, all those sleepless nights, anxious calls, and tense community gatherings felt validated. Cyrus and his cronies looked shell-shocked, and rightly so. The judge's condemnation wasn't just a moral victory. It was a financial punishment that would cripple the board's shady operation. It also meant that the old guidelines were effectively recognized, and none of us had to worry about losing our pools or being forced to shell out money for nonsensical modifications. However, the fight wasn't quite over. We soon discovered that Cyrus attempted to appeal the decision. Our attorneys assured us that appeals are common and can sometimes drag out the process. But given the strength of the trial record, it was unlikely the appellate court would reverse such a thorough verdict. True to predictions, the appellate process took several more months, but the original ruling was upheld without major changes. Meanwhile, the rest of the board members, faced with personal exposure to the damage award, quit their positions. Some left the neighborhood altogether. Cyrus himself eventually disappeared, presumably once he realized he couldn't manipulate our community for profit any longer. Without that corrupt leadership, the HOA had to reorganize. Eventually, a new, more transparent board was elected, and they made it a priority to abide by the rules and keep open communication with residents. In the aftermath of the lawsuit, we tried to restore a sense of normalcy. Our street, once overshadowed by conflict and tension, felt livable again. Neighbors who had been divided started to reconnect, hosting small barbecues and block parties. We decided to move forward without focusing on the bitterness of the past. The settlement money definitely helped cover the legal costs and other losses we'd incurred, though I wish I could say everyone spent their share on something celebratory. Several neighbors used a chunk of their compensation to pay off debts they'd racked up trying to deal with legal fees. Others put the money toward maintaining their pools or upgrading safety features. We all agreed, though, that the greatest reward wasn't monetary. It was knowing we'd stood firm to protect our rights. We made it clear that no bully, however cunning, could override the law or push us around in our own homes. Looking back, I realized the entire ordeal tested our community's spirit. Before it all started, we were mostly a collection of individuals who waved politely from our driveways. But in pushing us to band together, ironically, Cyrus gave us a stronger sense of unity. People who were once casual acquaintances became allies, and we discovered just how powerful a collective voice can be when facing injustice. You don't really appreciate that until you're in the thick of a battle, worried that you might lose your home or your financial security. Our neighborhood had to face an existential threat to realize the strength in mutual support. Interestingly, in the months that followed, I got to see a different side of some of the families. We started forming small committees of our own to discuss landscaping, security, and amenities, always holding open forums, making sure everyone got a vote, and remembering the fiasco that had just ended. More people began attending these forums than ever went to HOA meetings before. We even discovered a couple of neighbors were especially talented at project management and volunteer coordination, so they took the lead on planning community events. Our block transformed from a place of tension into a place of genuine cooperation. One day, after the dust settled, I remember sitting by my pool, no longer worrying about fines or threats, looking at the water gently rippling under the late afternoon sun. It felt surreal. Just months earlier, the thought of losing this space or being forced to tear it out had caused me endless anxiety. Now, it was a symbol of victory. I'd kept my property as it was intended, and more than that, I'd helped ensure that everyone else could keep theirs too. I even thought about hosting a pool party to celebrate the end of the entire ordeal. Eventually, I did. We invited every neighbor, even those who didn't have pools or hadn't been directly involved in the suit. It was a celebration of our renewed sense of community. At that gathering, I noticed a few new faces, people who had just recently moved in. They were relieved to hear the major trouble was behind us. One or two asked if we felt safe under this new iteration of the HOA. I explained that we had voted in a fresh slate of board members who were dedicated to transparency, fair dealing, and community engagement. We had a set of bylaws that everyone had collectively agreed upon, and while it might not be perfect, it was certainly miles better than anything Cyrus had concocted. Everyone was optimistic. There was talk of installing new play areas for children, upgrading our community clubhouse, and maybe even organizing a neighborhood watch to keep things extra safe. The tension of the past had, in a strange way, galvanized us into wanting to build a model community that others might envy. During that party, Quincy and I swapped stories about the crazy lengths we'd gone through in the legal fight. We laughed about how clueless we'd felt in the beginning, thinking it was all just a bizarre mistake. We shook our heads at our own naivete, but we also acknowledged that in the face of a complex legal problem, we'd done the right thing. We sought professional help, then stood firm, and refused to be intimidated. I think we both realized something profound about homeownership. That it's more than just a financial investment. It's about preserving the space you've created for your family, your peace of mind, and your sense of belonging. The moment we let someone strip away our rights through intimidation or shady rule changes, we're giving up more than just our backyard oasis. We're losing control over our everyday lives. Of course, not everyone was ready to let go of grudges. A few neighbors found it hard to forgive the handful of residents who had initially supported Cyrus and his new rules. From what I understand, some of those early supporters did so because they honestly believed stricter guidelines would improve the neighborhood. However, they didn't realize the full extent of the corruption. Over time, I think most of them came around, but it took a bit longer for the rest of us to trust them again. In the end, though, living in a neighborhood is an ongoing process of compromise and communication. We all still have a ways to go in healing the rifts, but with the main source of conflict gone, the future looks brighter. One subplot that stands out in my memory is how some local realtors reacted after the lawsuit became public. A couple of realty offices had begun warning prospective buyers about the ongoing dispute in our neighborhood, which threatened to lower property values if it dragged on. After we won, though, those same offices did a complete turnaround, praising how the neighborhood had championed homeowners' rights and enforced accountability. Suddenly, we became a desirable place to live for folks who wanted an environment where the community stands up for itself. It was a funny shift. One day we were pariahs, the next we were heroes. But that's how perception works, I guess. Another mini-drama involving the county construction inspector. The board tried to convince the court that our pools violated building codes throughout the trial, likely to terrify them into thinking we were dangerous. When the inspector testified that all pools had legal, current permits, that claim collapsed. He had nearly a decade of paperwork showing each homeowner followed the rules. The inspector's calm, thorough response to the board's claims was one of the trial's highlights. It made the board look desperate. We talked after the win with Simone, the neighbor who almost got a lien. She said she was close to selling her house at a loss to avoid the HOA's disaster. Her relief when the judge overturned the fines was immense. This experience showed her that coalitions are often stronger than individual efforts. Without our help, she could have crashed financially. It taught me the value of solidarity in such confrontations. Sometimes you need community strength to win. The eventual answer was a full HOA audit. The court-ordered audit found other problematic spending beyond the landscaping contract. Thousands of dollars were spent on consultant fees for people with no credentials, and the board had little internal checks and balances. The new HOA leadership promised monthly financial reports and public budgeting after the audit. That alone was a significant improvement over Cyrus's concealment. Running any association is difficult, but the environment is healthy enough that no one is being surprised by strange charges or hidden costs. Wow, so much has changed since that first letter appeared in my mailbox. That letter and the final court verdict are still in a folder. On hard days, I look at them and remember that fighting for what's right can make the difference between feeling powerless and winning. Instead of giving up, we organized, obtained legal advice, and demanded justice. A thunderous justice was served. A few months ago, I observed a "for sale" sign in front of the residence of a board member who resigned after the ruling. In neighborhoods, people come and go. However, no new board or showy foreigner will readily push us around again. We've experienced bitterness, and we won't repeat it. If you charge exorbitant rates or violate our rights, we'll unite. We still laugh, with a hint of bitterness, at greedy HOA fines 13 houses with pools not authorized in the new HOA system. Those who endured the legal tempest now joke about it. Someone always mentions how we ended up in court together, made new friends and allies, and won a decent cash triumph for everyone at community events. Money wasn't the goal. Of course, the $874,000 granted to the 13 of us has helped ease many burdens. Reclaiming our home security was the real prize. It demonstrated that a few committed residents can resist deception and corruption. We never thought we'd be in court over backyard pools, but life has a way of surprising us. Friends, thank you. See you soon.